New Deal, it is important to remember that it encompasses many different issues that society was facing and resulted in a tremendous amount of legislation.
Roosevelt's New Deal legislation included the Farm Mortgage Refinancing Act, an effort to slow the rate of farm foreclosures. The Social Security Act established a system of national unemployment relief and old age financial support. The New Deal also included important legislation for labor. The right to join a union and bargain collectively was written into law. Roosevelt created the Labor Relations Board to oversee collective bargaining conflicts and investigate unfair labor practices.
As part of his inaugural address, FDR tried to provide Americans with some hope that things would be getting better. He declared a nationwide banking holiday to last from March 6th through the 10th, as a prelude to opening the banks on a sounder basis. He summoned Congress in a special session to cope with the national emergency, and in just 8 hours, this Congress created the Emergency Banking Relief Act of 1933, which would allow banks that were solvent to reopen and give the president the power to regulate banking transactions. To further his banking reforms, Congress supported public reliance on the banking system by enacting the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act, a measure that provided for the establishment of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which insured individual deposits up to $5,000. FDR then turned to the radio to deliver fireside chats, to reassure the public that it was now safer to keep money in a reopened bank than it was to keep it under a mattress or in a coffee can in the backyard. And America's confidence returned as banks began to unlock their doors. Because his programs would likely cost a tremendous amount, he also began to cut government expenditures in other areas so that the money could be shifted to relief. He cut salaries and pensions, for example. Everyone would hurt a little bit so that everyone could recover. He also pulled the United States off the gold standard and ordered all private holdings of gold to be surrendered to the Treasury in exchange for paper currency. He wanted inflation, which he believed would relieve debtors' burdens and stimulate new production, gold buying, and overall increase the value of gold. To assist farmers, the government began offering the refinancing of farm mortgages at low interest rates to reduce their payments so that hopefully farmers could keep their farms. Additional low interest rate loans would be available for farmers who had already lost their land so that they could purchase new land through the Farm Credit Administration. And preferably they would purchase their land in areas that was not quite so hard hit by the ongoing drought. He applied the same ideas to non-farm homes, allowing the refinancing of loans at new low rates to hopefully prevent people from losing their homes to foreclosure. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, would eventually lead to the establishment of the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which was authorized in 1934. The FHA insured residential loans and thus encouraged lenders to offer long-term 20 or 30-year fixed-rate mortgages. FHA housing activity would receive further support when the Federal National Mortgage Association, or the FNMA, was created in 1938. It purchased FHA-insured loans, thus establishing an important secondary market and liquidity, which is the ease of turning loans into cash for local savings and loans associations. In other words, a bank that was nearing its limit for loaning money could sell some of its mortgage holdings to another bank that didn't have enough loans. To provide direct relief to the unemployed, FDR used federal money to assist the unemployed directly and so-called primed the pump of the industrial recovery. Congress created the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC, which provided employment in government camps for about 3 million young men to keep them away from crime. Their work included reforestation, firefighting, flood control, swamp drainage, and conservation. Many states already had relief programs in place, but they were just being overwhelmed by the incredible demand. So the first major effort of the new Congress was to tackle adult unemployment with the Federal Emergency Relief Act. That aimed for immediate relief rather than long-term recovery. The resulting Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FERA, headed by Harry Hopkins, granted about $3 billion to the states for wages on various work projects and dole payments, the dole being another name for welfare. FDR also established the Civil Works Administration, or CWA, late in 1933, also under Harry Hopkins, and it was designed to provide temporary jobs during a particularly cruel winter emergency. The Works Progress Administration, or WPA, which in 1939 was renamed the Works Projects Administration, would be the largest and most ambitious American relief agency, and also would be headed by Harry Hopkins. It employed mostly unskilled men to carry out public works infrastructure projects. They built more than 4,000 new school buildings, erected 130 new hospitals, laid roughly 9,000 miles of storm drains and sewer lines, built 29,000 new bridges, constructed 150 new airfields, paved or repaired 280,000 miles of roads, and planted 24 million trees. At its peak in 1938, the WPA provided jobs for 3 million unemployed men and women, as well as youth in a separate division known as the National Youth Administration, or NYA. The WPA sometimes took over state and local relief programs that had originated in Hoover's Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or those that had originated in the Federal Emergency Relief Administration programs. More famous project, Federal Project Number 1. The WPA employed musicians, artists, writers, actors, and directors in large-scale arts, drama, media, and literacy projects. At its height, Federal One employed 5,300 visual artists and related professionals, some of them later becoming world-renowned. The architecture of many U.S. buildings constructed as a part of these relief projects is often referred to as PWA Moderne, for Public Works Administration, which was another New Deal program, or Depression Modern. The style blended neoclassical and Art Deco elements. Some politicians criticized the WPA for its inefficiencies, because their construction projects sometimes ran 3 to 4 times the cost of private work. But some of this was intentional, because the WPA avoided cost-saving technologies and machinery in order to hire more workers. Despite these attacks, the WPA is celebrated today for the employment that it offered to millions during the darkest days of the Great Depression, and for its lasting legacy of well-built schools, dams, roads, bridges, and other buildings and structures, many of which are still in use today. Since 1918, farmers had been suffering from increasingly low prices and overproduction, particularly for grain crops. During the Depression, conditions became desperate as innumerable mortgages were foreclosed upon and farmers lost their farms. Emergency Congress established the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. Through artificial scarcity, this agency was to establish parity prices for basic commodities. Parity was the price set for a product that gave it the same real value as it had between 1909 to 1914. And the AAA would eliminate price-depressing surpluses by paying growers to reduce their crops. The millions of dollars needed for these payments was to be raised by taxing farm processors. Because of the high number of people on relief, though, some people considered this to be a sinful destruction of food. The Commodity Credit Corporation also aided farmers with loans for purchases and payments in the production and marketing of agricultural commodities. It also allowed the sale and donation of agricultural products to other government agencies and even other countries. But these were challenged to the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1936, in the case of the United States v. Butler, the Supreme Court killed the AAA by declaring its regulatory taxation provisions unconstitutional, since the regulation of agriculture was deemed a state power under the 10th Amendment. So in 1938, Congress passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1938, or the second AAA, which remedied the technical issues that had led to the overturning of the first AAA, and the farm program basically continued. The only real change was that it would be financed by the federal government's general fund and not a processor's tax. Still another major New Deal program was the Public Works Administration, or PWA. It built large-scale public works projects like roads, dams, bridges, hospitals, and schools. More than 39,000 projects would be funded until the end of the program in 1943. Now, don't confuse this with the WPA. Although it did do some larger projects, the WPA focused mostly on smaller projects, while the PWA focused on larger scale projects, such as the water system and dam pictured here. The PWA also hired skilled workers, while the WPA mostly hired unskilled workers. The Emergency Congress attempted to stimulate a nationwide comeback with the passage and creation of the National Recovery Administration, or the NRA, which was designed to assist labor, industry, and the unemployed. Individual industries were to work out codes for fair competition, under which hours of labor would be reduced so that employment could be spread over more people, essentially establishing minimum wages. Workers under the NRA were formally guaranteed the right to organize and to bargain collectively through representatives of their own choosing, and an anti-union contract was forbidden. The Blue Eagle was the symbol of the NRA, and the slogan was, "We do our part." Businesses that agreed to these codes could be allowed to display the Blue Eagle to encourage Americans to only spend money on those products or in those stores that had the Blue Eagle. But too much self-sacrifice was expected of labor, industry, and the public for such a scheme to truly work. The electric power industry also attracted the attention of New Deal reformers. As a public utility, it reached directly and regularly into the pocketbooks of consumers, and New Dealers accused it of using excess rates. The Tennessee River would provide a rare opportunity to make some changes. The river valley contained some 2.5 million of the most poverty-stricken people in America living alongside it. By developing the hydroelectric potential of the region, Washington could combine the immediate advantage of putting thousands of people to work with a long-term project for reforming the power supply monopoly, and they get the bonus of providing flood control as well. The 100 Days Congress passed an act creating the Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA, in 1933. This new agency was determined to discover precisely how much the production and distribution of electricity cost. Utility corporations, though, lashed back at this low-cost TVA power as they didn't want their profits interrupted. Still, the project was successful, bringing to the area not only full employment and cheap electric power, but low-cost housing, abundant cheap nitrates for fertilizer, a restoration of eroded soil, reforestation, and even flood control. Now, during his election campaign, FDR had taken a stance that the 18th Amendment needed to go. More money was being spent on enforcement than had ever been anticipated, and more money was even being spent than relieving programs for the Great Depression. He argued that the money that was being spent on enforcement could have gone to providing depression relief. Drinkings and problems associated with drinking may have declined due to prohibition, but few would argue that criminal activity wasn't a problem. But prior to FDR taking office, the 21st Amendment was finally ratified, which repealed the 18th Amendment, and many celebrated FDR's inauguration by toasting the end of Prohibition. It proved to be a popular part of the New Deal, though it technically isn't actually a part of the New Deal.